Let's bow our heads for a time of prayer. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Our Father and our God, again we've gathered together to look into your word that you've given to John, your servant. We thank you for him. We thank you for the words that you've given to him. And we ask that you will enlighten us today as to what you have in the future for your children and for those unbelievers also. We give you thanks and praise, honor, and glory in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, let's start off on the chalkboard again. We've been through the seal judgments. We've been through the trumpet judgments. We have not been through the bowl judgments yet. Now, the things that we talked about last week about Satan, and today we're going to talk about the good guys. Last week was the bad guys. And there are other things that we need to know. Now, that's what we were talking about these last couple of weeks, and this week, and next week. These are other things that it's not in a consecutive order. In other words, these things that we're talking about didn't happen between the trumpet and the bowl judgments. They're printed that way in the book of Revelation, but it's not a consecutive thing. What we're talking about is other things that you need to know that are happening along with the trumpet and the bowl judgments. Okay? So, some of the other things that you need to know, we talked about last week about Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet. We talked about those last week. We talked about the conflict between good and evil, and that's what this is all about. Satan and Christ, it's good and evil. We're going to be talking about the final judgments, that's the bowl judgments, but we need to know more about the players that are involved in this tribulation, this period of tribulation, this time of Jacob's trouble. We've talked about Satan and his history, his past history, present, and future history of Satan. And we'll get into that a little more in some of the future chapters and the future of Satan. And he has a very dim future. It's not good, as you already know.
Why is it called the time of Jacob's trouble?
Boy, I never thought about that. Jacob, here, Jacob was the father of Israel.
Isaac and Jacob, yeah. Then
The children of Israel.
Jacob became
the
Israel.
nation of Israel. The nation of Israel in this time is a very bad time.
Okay.
It's a good time for Israel, those that survive, but there are going to be many, maybe 2/3 of the nation of Israel destroyed during the tribulation period. So it is a time of Jacob's trouble. Okay?
Isn't that taken from when
What's that?
Jacob was returning to the land of Israel, and he went on the other side of that creek or river, and he was fearful for his brother. He's going to meet his brother the next day,
Mm-hmm.
and he wrestled with the angel that night.
Yes, he changed his name.
But isn't that referred to as Jacob's trouble?
Well, he changed his
Well,
name.
it was at that time,
From Jacob to Israel.
but it's also refers to Israel as a whole, and their time during the tribulation period when there will be much trouble for the Israelites, and a large percentage of them will die during the tribulation period. So, we've talked about that before, and we'll visit that again in the future. This period that we're talking about last week, when we talk about Satan and these, all of these judgments, is perhaps the darkest period of world history ever. And it's coming just before Christ returns to the earth. There is a lot of deception and persecution, and the two beasts are out there, and they're slaughtering people, and we think that's an awful thing. We get a small picture of that when we watch the TV and see how ISIS is cutting the heads off of Christians. And you ever think what would happen if they would be here and you had to bow down and have your head chopped off? Well, anyhow, in chapter 14, chapter 14, John is given a vision of Christ's victorious triumph over evil. And John, we're going to let you read that today.
All right.
Before we get started. Chapter 14 in the book of Revelation.
The Lamb and the 144,000. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they kept themselves pure. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among men and offered as first fruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. The three angels. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." A second angel followed and said, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries." A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, "If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. He will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name." This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on." "Yes," says the Spirit, "they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." The harvest of the earth. I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire, came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia.
Wow. Thank you, John. In chapter 14, John is given a vision of Christ's victorious triumph over the earth, and that's what this chapter is all about. He thrusts his sickle of judgment to destroy Satan's rule over the earth, and this happens at the second coming of Christ. When he comes back, this will happen. It's when it does happen, it's the end of the tribulation time, the bowl judgments, which we will encounter in the next couple of weeks. Not only that, but it's the beginning of the millennial reign, or the 1,000 reign of Christ, which will be a time when Christ created the heavens and the earth, the animals and man, and then man sinned. Well, in the beginning, everything was perfect, like in the Garden of Eden. Well, 6,000 years, Satan has just ruined everything, made it hard, made it evil. And now, for 1,000 years, God is going to show the world, everybody, what it was supposed to be like at creation. And Satan ruined it. Now that Satan is gone, then we have 1,000 years where Christ will rule, and it'll be just like he intended it to be in the Garden of Eden. This chapter, as we said, is parenthetical in as much as it's not in a chronological order. In the scriptures, we're reading it between the trumpet and the bowl judgments, but it's other things that we need to know, is what we're talking about last week and what we're talking about this week again. It's in the meantime, while these other things are happening, victory is assured now in chapter 14. John sees a lamb, and when we think of the lamb, we think of who? The Messiah, okay. Standing on Mount Zion with 144,000 Jewish believers. Now, these are the 144,000 that we talked about before, that God sealed 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel. And when we think about that, many times we think that these 144,000 were all in Israel. But don't forget, they have been scattered throughout the whole world. And so here we have 144,000 throughout the whole world that are preaching the gospel of Christ. And now, at the end of this whole turmoil, time of judgment, here is Christ standing with the 144,000.
Do you think, Dad, that the earth will still have populations, let's say in Africa or South America, but that Christ will just be ruling from Jerusalem?
Yes. you're not going to be here, but we'll be dealing with that in a couple of weeks. And we see the millennial reign and what it's going to be like, and who's who, and if there's going to be sea or land or whatever. But you hold that, and I'll talk to you about that at lunchtime. But anyhow, John sees this 144,000, and John sees that the Father's name was written in their foreheads. Now you remember when we talked about this 144,000, that God put a mark on them to seal them, so that nobody, that Satan, on Satan's side, could hurt them. They were sealed. And I'm not sure if people could see them then, but here, when they're standing with Christ, you could see the Father's name written on their foreheads. And the proof that they were the 144,000. They were protected during the 7 years of tribulation, and they have come through the great tribulation, and they have come through victoriously, and they are ready now to enter into the 1,000-year millennial reign of Christ. It gives us a real graphic description of this 144,000. They were Jewish believers, Jewish, and believers, both. So these 144,000 had accepted Christ. They were believers, Jewish Christians, whatever, however you want to say it. They were Jewish believers. They were virgin men, never had been married or been with a woman at all. They were loyal to Christ. They were willing to follow the Lamb wherever. Now, here's one. They were the first fruits unto God. When we look at scriptures, we go back into the Old Testament, and there, the first fruits of your animals were dedicated to God. The first fruits of children were dedicated to God. Well, the first fruits of the male child belong to God. And, well, we could get into that more, but if your first male child back then belonged to God, and you had to take a sacrifice to God and give it to God to replace or in place of that son that you just had. But the first fruit belonged to God. The first fruits of their crops in the fields belonged to God. The first fruits of their fruit on the trees or whatever, it all belonged to God. And so here he is describing this 144,000 as first fruits, the cream of the crop, the best, the first. That's this 144,000. They were saved at the beginning of the tribulation period. There was no deceit in their mouths. Wow. How many today would fit into that category? No deceit in their mouths. They were without blemish before God. Now you can be that way. How can you be without blemish before God?
His righteousness covers our sin when we ask for forgiveness. And we stand before him and he doesn't see it.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
I must have had a good teacher.
You did. I think so.
They possess character and commitment to the Lord. They had the strength to stand against the Antichrist and all of his demonic program. They were singing a new song. They were singing a new song that they had learned or they had heard, and they were standing there before the throne of God. But the interesting thing here is they could not be heard by any men. Only this 144,000 heard this new song. Now, as I told you before, most everything that we talk about that God does in the book of Revelation, we have an example or a sample of it before in the scriptures. Well, now you remember in chapter 9 of the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul was confronted by Christ on the road to Damascus. Shake your head, yes, yeah. And what happened there? He heard the angel or whoever was speaking to him, the voice from heaven, but those around him didn't hear. This was similar to what's happening here. This 144,000, they heard the song, but the others did not. It seemed to be a song of praise and celebration of Christ's victorious triumph over the earth. This is following his second coming and right before the millennial kingdom starts. Well, then we have the 6 angels, and they appear to announce God's final judgment on the ungodly world system. And it talks about the everlasting gospel. And everybody wants to know, what is the everlasting gospel? Well, what is the gospel? The gospel is
The good news of Jesus.
good news. Okay. The gospel is good news. So it must be everlasting good news. In Romans 1:1, it tells us about the gospel of God. Okay? In Galatians 1:7, it's the gospel of Christ. In Matthew 24, it's the gospel of the kingdom. So what is this everlasting gospel? It's the proclamation that man needs to fear God and give him glory and worship in light of the impending judgment. In other words, it's God's last call of grace and the opportunity to believe in God. Dr. John Woolward explains it this way. The everlasting gospel is ageless, and it's not for any specific period of time. It's an announcement of the hour of judgment of God and a command to worship Him. It's good news that God is about to deal with the world in righteousness and establish His sovereignty over the world. Throughout eternity, God will continue to manifest Himself in grace toward the saints and in punishment toward the wicked. The everlasting God.
So do you think that during this millennial reign, men and women will continue to have children, and they must make a choice during that period to serve Him?
Yes. Yes.
And that's why it's the everlasting gospel for them?
It will last on through the millennium. Children will be born. They have to make a decision. And that's why I think she wants in here. Where was I? I forgot now.
Well, we're where I would ask you that question about if there would be children born. And
there will be children born. It even mentions that a child at 300 years will still be a child. So there will be children born, and those children born during the millennium will still have an opportunity to accept or reject Christ. Because at the end of the 1,000 years, as we will look at later on again, everything is later on here, you know. Later on, we'll discover that the devil is released from being chained in the pit. He will be released for a short period of time, and he will gather those people that have rejected Christ during the millennium, and they will be together cast into the lake of fire. So, yes.
I have a question. Concerning the everlasting gospel, there's another gospel being preached today by some churches that man evolved, but then God kind of like helped in the evolutionary process. They do not believe that God is the creator, and we are to worship him who created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. This I view as the everlasting gospel, the ones that believe that God is indeed the creator, that he created man and not, I mean, some of these churches preach this evolutionary garbage.
Everything about Christ, Satan has an alternative. And this is a gospel that Satan promotes, just like he has an antichrist and anti-everything. Here is an anti-gospel that even churches who call themselves Christian churches today proclaim. So yes, that's very true.
there are churches now in even where we live who are trying to say it's okay to take the mark of the beast. I mean, they try to distort everything.
Some churches preach even it's a right for homosexuals to marry.
Right.
Even ordaining a minister as a homosexual as a minister. I mean, it's
right.
Going pretty far.
They totally. I don't know. Sometimes some of these prosperity gospels, they also have shifted away from the true everlasting gospel.
Very true. And this everlasting gospel will be good news to believers who have suffered through Satan's wrath during the tribulation, but it'll be bad news for the unsaved because of the coming judgment. So it's good news for some, it's bad news for others. Verse 8, Babylon is fallen. Fallen. Babylon was a wicked city, and it represents not only the city of Babylon, but wicked nations also. Nations who followed after some religious or political corruption that he was just talking about, they too will suffer judgment during this time. If they are not following the will of Christ, then they have to suffer the consequences. Verse 9, those who worship the beast and the mark of the beast in their forehead drink of the wine of the wrath of God, and they are sealed to damnation. There is no possibility of salvation for them anymore. Forever. How long is forever? It's a long time, I think. Where are they going to end up? In the lake of fire. Slip over to chapter 20 and verse 15. Somebody read that. We haven't flipped back and looked at scriptures today. Chapter 20 verse 15 says, Okay.
It says anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire.
Where there is no rest day or night for the wicked, but for the believers there is rest eternally. That's the good news. And we talk about purgatory. Now, purgatory is an intermediate place for people to go where there is purging and cleansing and so on. How does that grab you? We are believers and we are cleansed by the blood of the Lamb. So we get a get out of purgatory free card and we can go straight to eternity. And you know, well, there's others who believe in if you die, it'll just be annihilation of the body and the soul and the spirit.
Well, you think about how difficult it might be during the tribulation even to get a drink of water, because the water company, if you don't have the mark, they might shut off your water. I mean, just to be able to drink, let alone buy and sell. I know a lot of people think, well, I'm safe, I'm a farmer, I have everything I need. Do you have a well? You know?
And your neighbors know you have
We
it too.
talked about it a few weeks ago, that well will be pumping out blood.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be so good either. But we are redeemed and we will live eternally. So forget annihilation. It's not going to happen. Verse 12. Believers will realize that martyrdom for their faith is far better than eternal death and suffering in the lake of fire. Sometimes we don't realize what the lake of fire might be like. And it was brought very clear to my mind, and I mentioned this before, I think. I was in New Zealand, and I visited this whole lake that was boiling. You can't get too close because there's sand along the edge of the lake is bubbling up, boiling. It's hot. So hot that they drill down and get steam from under the ground and pipe it down into a generating plant and plant or generate their electricity that way. It's hot.
Does it stink like sulfur?
I can't tell you.
The only comparison I have is Camp Joy.
Well,
Remember the water?
Camp Joy is nothing compared to a lake, a whole lake that is boiling, bubbling, and steam coming up.
Do you remember that sulfur smell when you took a drink, though?
Yes, I do. Verse 13. Commitment to Christ during the Great Tribulation will mean martyrdom for many true believers. So they will consider that off with your head now is better for eternity than to submit to the Satan and his whatever and go to hell. So Christ is victorious and he is able and he will conquer everything. There's a special blessing and a reward to those for their love and commitment to the Lord, especially during the tribulation period. And as we see, there are those around the throne of God that are close to God that have been beheaded during the tribulation. And every time I watch the TV and see where the ISIS people have beheaded 20 or 21 or whatever, I think of that there is a special place in heaven for those people. Would you be willing to be one of them?
Might be the easy way out.
Because they beheading better days.
Maybe when the time comes.
Are those possibly the saints under the altar? They're like the
They're
sick.
crying out.
Yeah, they're crying out.
When they cry out, how long, how long?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've lost my head. When are you going to settle things here? Yeah. Very serious. Well, in verse 14, Christ is posed to bring judgment. He has a sharp sickle. He's ready to pour out judgment, divine judgment, wrath upon the ungodly at the end of the tribulation. During the tribulation, each of these judgments, the seal judgments, and then the trumpet judgments are worse yet, and now as we will get to the bowl judgments, they are worse than ever. And I think the people here, the unbelievers, are or will be getting worse and worse. Well, they are already, I think. But they will be getting worse and worse during this tribulation period. And so...
Well, they curse God for all of the seals and trumpets and bowls.
They
curse Him
They curse God.
for that.
And you would think after some of these judgments that they would finally repent, but they do not, and they will not, and so God's judgment comes down on them. The fourth angel proclaims, now do it, the time has come, go for it. Verse 15, harvest the ungodly. It is God's specific time. When will it happen? In God's specific time, in His appointed time. Not a minute too soon or a minute too late. Everything happens in God's time. And when these angels say, go for it, God, it's time to thrust your sickle in and reap the harvest on the earth. Reap the harvest of the ungodly. The wicked are destroyed, and God will use these angels to carry out the destruction on the ungodly. In verse 18, we have the altar of incense, where prayers of the saints are offered and divine judgment is dispensed in response to the prayers of the saints. In the tabernacle, that altar of incense was right before, right in front of this huge curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the most holy place. It separated the people from the altar where the commandments and the manna and so on were in the altar. It was separating the people from the place where God alone lived, where the Shekinah glory came up from. It was separating them from that. And from that altar came the prayers of the saints. As the priest offered incense there, it was like the prayers of the saints. No one could go beyond that. And in verse 19, the wine press. What happens in a wine press?
The grapes are smashed.
Where grapes are smashed, yes. It's a pit. We talk about, who was it? that God came down and visited him, and what was he doing? He was in the wine press stomping
Hiding.
out grapes.
I thought it was Heidi.
That was who?
That was
Gideon.
Gideon. He was hiding in the wine.
Yeah, he was hiding there. That's where God found him. And God says, you need to get out and do something.
Yeah.
These are described as people in the wine press, and God comes to trample them, to
Wine
judge
press.
them,
Outside the city, it says the wine
bring the
press was.
catastrophe outside. The battle of that great day of God Almighty, we describe it as Armageddon. The last great battle before Christ comes.
Pastor Chuck, some of us that are singing today have to leave right now to go to our practice. So it's not that we're boycotting any of this information.
But you're gonna get even with me when you sing.
Yes, maybe.
You can leave while we sing if you want.
Okay,
can plug your ears.
well, we'll leave it there for now. The carnage from this great battle will last for 200 miles. That's a lot of, well, there's gonna be a tremendous army, or armies, plural, meet there on that great battlefield. And we'll begin there next time. And then we'll go on to chapter 15, which I'm sure you will have read by that time. And thank you for coming, and thank you for you that are left, you're not singers.
Guess
Not
not.
singers. Well, join me, we're listeners. You gotta have listeners when there's music.
Trust me, he's not a singer. It all comes out the same note.
Can't have everything.
Any questions you can ask?
Questions? Yes.